Good morning. April, end of term. Thanks for coming, guys. And it's final stretch of the term. All the more I'm thankful that you could join us here. And let me start off by underlining and reminding you that we can also respect the Lekwungen, Songs and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Masonic peoples whose historical relationship with the land continues to this day. For this, I'm very happy to present to you, and I think, again, here we don't need too much introduction, but on the side, you might want to know that he has been around here in UVic for some time, teaching as a professor in the departments of philosophy and environmental studies, and that gives you a sense already of the focus of his work. So he works on environmental philosophy, history philosophy, aesthetics of prehistoric art. So I'm not sure this will figure in your talk today, but you have an astonishing and admirable range of research interest. And Tom is clearly a scholar who exemplifies commitment to interdisciplinary research. And you can see here how, he, from social sciences, humanities, and philosophy, archaeologist, art historian, he is a man of the 19th century, or I'm not sure that's see here with Tom has been also lecturing around the world, particularly in Spain, where he spends quite a bit of time. So he's not only multidisciplinary, but also his geographical reach is quite, impressive and sites of research. And I think that's for someone who is in philosophy, not only reading books, but he's going to places and exploring things on the ground. I think that's quite unique in terms of your research skills that you bring here. So wonderful to have you back at the center, and the floor is all yours to talk about beyond climate anxiety and catastrophism towards narratives for climate action.
Right. Did you want to give the land acknowledgement?
I really did. Yeah, I didn't.
I didn't hear that. Okay, good.
You didn't sing.
So we are, we're going to back in time a bit, here and there. So, let me just show you some slides. I learned from an archaeologist, because I work with archaeologists, I figured that you should show pictures. So I do, but the pictures are not necessarily necessary. They're kind of complementary to entertain your right brain, while your left brain is trying to attend to me, right? So let me see if this works here. Yeah. So, okay, I also want to acknowledge there's somebody entering, right? The Lekwungen peoples on whose territory we are. And so let me see if this is work.
Yeah,
where do I point?
No, this way, you're there.
There?
To Leah.
Okay. Hello, Leah.
Click on that.
No, I think Leah, you moved the mouse, so you have to go back to the lower part of there. Yeah.
How's that?
Okay, that's good.
Okay, so just want to say something about the origin of the paper. I've been teaching in human dimensional climate change for 10 years at least, before 2 years or 3 years ago when they canceled it. And, showing pictures and talking about how we're in a very difficult situation, and that, we need to act immediately, otherwise a disaster situation will follow us, kind of the normal thing that I did talk about. And then had a guest lecture by Andrew Weaver in my course, and he sort of changed the discourse in a radical way. And he said, he had also been talking in that sense, and Andrew Weaver, was in the legislature representing the Green Party of British Columbia as a leader, and they made a significant impact in the legislation. But so he's also in the IPCC, he was honored as one of the Nobel winning prize people for the work on modeling. So, but he came to class and said, he had changed his tune on how to think about climate change when he saw his son growing up, and he and his friends being very much struck by climate anxiety, and even that some of those friends of his friends tried suicide, right? So he sort of tried to change his discourse, and since then I've been trying that myself. Also, I make reference to other peoples, indigenous peoples, for example, South America and also North America, and I collaborated with a friend of mine, Lorenzo Maxul, who researched indigenous people in Alberta, and the kind of story that you hear from them, also just a couple of weeks ago from Jeff Corntasel, is colonial exploitation is as much or more of a concern for them than climate change. So this is kind of the origin of the paper.
You today.
Okay,
Do it here.
you do it. Next. Okay, so yeah, more. Yeah, right. So it's work in progress, and I may as well ask people what the students, they give presentations in my courses, and half of them start their presentation with this question: have you any experience climate anxiety? Anybody here has ever experienced that a bit?
No, nobody.
Everybody except for that's good.
The least ever.
Yeah, okay, all right. So, it's an interesting question that people ask. And there's some constant downtown Victoria, by the way. So pictures, eye candy, okay, there's one. Let's go on. You go on, you do it. Climate change, right, a bit of that, yeah. This is one of the places where you can see the changes on these. This is one of those striking pictures. It's about, I think there's something like 50 or 70 years. When all the ice is gone. One more. Okay, introduction, right. Okay. So I'm going to be having to skip quite a bit of text, I think, here and there, so I will do that. So hopefully it won't be too striking. So, the reality of anthropogenic climate change is sinking into public awareness more and more. The reality, however, I say, is subject to interpretation. And depending on levels of informational and affective preparation, those interpretive accounts can lead to feelings of fear and anxiety. Apparently, this increasingly is the case among young people who may become psychologically distressed by catastrophist messaging from activists and scientists from the elder generation, and manifest what has become known as eco or climate anxiety. Feelings of anxiety may become so pronounced that in some cases, those affected by this state may even be described as traumatized. While some advocates of action on climate change suppose that worries regarding the consequences of this global change phenomenon may spur people to more readily engage with the issue, there's considerable evidence to question whether climate fear and anxiety reliably support climate action. Prima facie, insofar as both fear and anxiety denote psychological states reflecting a degree of helplessness or lack of control over situations that threaten loss or harm to something of significant value to those concerned, actions taken regarding those situations will likely reflect that sense of lack of control in some way. Consequently, one should not take for granted that portrayal of the consequence of climate change in extremist terms will lead to action, or that if it does, the most reasonable or efficient actions will be taken. That is why those who describe the consequences of anthropogenic climate change as a series of disasters, eventually leading to a generalized catastrophe and the collapse of civilization, may do so in order to obtain support in pressing legitimate demands at the political and policy levels. The effect may not be what is hoped for. In fact, climate denialism in its various forms may actually be a fear response to catastrophist messaging, since it is easier to insist that there really is no problem than to address an issue that has already been portrayed as a lost cause. So while for many people, eco and climate anxiety may only be present at the subliminal level, not affecting their lives in obvious ways, for others, especially young, these affective states may interfere with their capacity to function and in serious cases generate health costs for society. Furthermore, insofar as fear and anxiety concerning climate change may interfere with optimal decision-making, these states of mind possibly also undermine effective climate action. In short, there are considerable reasons for being concerned about communication that engenders climate fear and anxiety. In the following, I argue that given the unhappy as well as inconvenient consequence of climate fears and anxiety, and given that much of this anxiety is the result of the manner in which the consequences of climate change are described, those who communicate on this issue have a serious responsibility to reframe how climate change is being narrated. Such reframing may furthermore support effective climate action. Key elements of such reframing are sketched. And sketch is correct. One more. A bit more. There. Okay. There are diverse ways in which fear and anxiety may be defined. Both of these terms make reference to mental states that are triggered by a condition or situation that is not easily mastered by the subject. One way in which fear and anxiety may be contrasted with each other is in terms of degrees of certainty. That is, anxiety generally is understood as having a less definite object or less clear-cut remedies than fear. For instance, unprepared individuals who climb a rock wall for the first time may be fearful of the experience for the simple reason that they do not believe that they can master the challenges presented. They may recognize the challenge for what it is, at least in outline, but feel excessively challenged by it. This contrasts with those who are well experienced in this sport, who, thanks to their training and experience, feel in control of the situation and therefore are not fearful, even well aware of residual risks. It also contrasts with those who are anxious, who discover that this undertaking presents challenges that they do not sufficiently understand or that they do not know how to master. Similarly, when speaking of the challenge represented by the consequences of climate change, for individuals who are unprepared to master particular situations, such as imminent flooding by a river or the release of a landslide, it is not unreasonable that they would experience fear. This contrasts with cases which individuals are able to adapt to expected disturbances and build up resilience, such that they feel in control of the situation and are not fearful, even if risk conscious. In contrast, climate anxiety seems to be associated with concerns for situations or events associated with climate change, regarding which people feel that they do not sufficiently understand or know how to master. Furthermore, at least in North America, for many individuals, anxiety about how a climatically changed world will unfold often seems to be conjoined with feelings of guilt, on the assumption of a shared society-wide responsibility for the situation. This especially seems to be the case among the young, who commonly have a heightened sense of justice and are less ready to shrug off blame than their elders. Such feelings of guilt may heighten anxiety even further, since individuals may feel a sense of inadequacy about not doing their part due to limited capacity for effective action. Some research argues that, at least in the richer countries and in university contexts, climate anxiety may be positively associated with pro-environmental behaviors, which are defined as recycling and green consumerism, and with environmental activism, such as participation in protest movements, though it also has negative implications for mental well-being, the research shows. Anxiety may be problematic in many ways, since it is a kind of psychological distress, is associated with feelings of helplessness, and among other things may constitute a distraction for one's intended projects. As such, climate anxiety may become debilitating for many individuals, as well as thwarting their ability to actively engage with the real challenges posed by climate change, thereby inducing a kind of learned helplessness. This suggests that climate anxiety may not be the best state of mind to engage with the more systematic climate actions that the present situation demands. In particular, actions such as generating demands for politically viable policies for mitigation, the creation of site-specific strategies for adaptation, the strengthening of community and society resilience, and sufficient transformation of society so that the previous types of action can be successful. Moreover, if intense tense enough, anxiety may go beyond generating distress and undesirable feelings and become traumatic. And such it deserves special consideration. Just as with fear and anxiety, trauma may also be defined in diverse ways. The Greek root of the term signifies wound, even if presently it generally is used in English in a wider sense. One way to characterize it is as disruptive loss. Trauma may overpower one's ways of coping, thereby leading to inability to address the challenges of life in a satisfactory way. So while in medical practice, the term trauma may be applied to bodily impacts that cause disruption of one's physical capacities, the term also is applied to a lasting emotional response to certain events, causing disruption of one's psychological capacities to respond to life's challenges. In the latter case, trauma is understood to provoke as, quote, sudden cessation of normalcy, the loss of coherence, the shattering of beliefs, end of quote. What is failing in cases of trauma is, quote, the capacity and opportunity for adaptation, end of quote. That is the capacity of the subject to make, quote, make use of one or more coping mechanisms in order to adjust to traumatic disruption. Okay, so I'd say a bit more about traumatic anxiety, climate anxiety. In today's media and in many well-meaning reports, contemporary anthropogenic climate change has variously been described as demanding immediate concerted action, only delayed at the risk of ultimate disaster. It is often pointed out that the rapidity of climate change is unprecedented in historical times, that many societies are and will be struggling to adjust to environmental changes with, quote, existential, end of quote, consequences such as flooding of island states, that agriculture in many areas will be confronted with degrees of climate variability that will make yields irregular and threaten those who depend on them, that species loss due to land use changes will be exacerbated by the increasing disruption of weather patterns, and so on. Certainly, for climate action to occur, it is absolutely essential, I think, that people be informed about the reality of climate change and its consequences. However, the steady stream of such reports while not accompanied with sufficient information on how to practically address this new and dynamically changing situation, may generate fears that humans do not have the wherewithal to deal with it. Fortunately, we have Oliver, who will help people get information how to deal with it, right? Okay.
When you're showing
saying I will deal with it.
He also will deal with it. It may also generate a generalized kind of anxiety insofar as there is uncertainty concerning the kinds of degrees of hazards that our societies have embarked to encounter, since global climate change is not something experienced by any of our contemporaries or recent ancestors. Furthermore, when the consequence of climate change poses a threat that seems to exceed people's capacities to cope with, the anxiety may become traumatic. As noted, it has been reported that the feelings of anxiety are very common among young people worldwide. In contrast, perhaps ironically, there seem to be populations who, despite having experienced hazardous climatic consequences, do not seem to be caught up in fear and anxiety, and instead are quite apt to adapt to the challenges posed. Some even seem to find that the effects of climate disruption are of secondary importance in comparison with other challenges caused by societal marginalization, colonial structures, and corruption in governance, particularly indigenous populations. Right? Okay, am I still with catastrophe framing? Yeah, good. So catastrophist framing climate change. This state of affairs suggests that much climate anxiety is the result of climate change being framed as leading toward a catastrophic end. The problems with this construal can be understood through the concept of risk. One very simplified way of representing risk is this one here, right? Probability of hazardous event. Oftentimes, you only get the first two parts there, right? And after having been interested in this topic for quite a long time, I, at some point, ran into Wisner and some other authors that wrote a book called At Risk, and they emphasize that vulnerability is key, right? So, you know, there may be a probability of a certain hazard happening, a landslide or an avalanche, but there's no risk if there's no vulnerability, right? And the same kind of event, you know, a landslide can be of very little risk if people are not vulnerable. So if they have either the means to restore or, you know, they have built in such a way that, you know, they are protected. I mean, in Mexico City, when the big earthquake happened, what's it, 30, 40 years ago, some buildings withstood perfectly well because they were built so that they're not vulnerable to earthquakes. So, and we tried to do that in Victoria about 25 years ago or so. We started rebuilding buildings on campus and so on, right? To diminish the vulnerability, right? So the event may be the same, but vulnerability has changed. So then the risk has changed, right? Under the construal of certain accounts, the suggested probability of catastrophic outcomes from climate change bringing about a collapse of societies is asserted to be between, and I'm quoting one author, non-negligible, meaning that it's there, and 100%. Some other authors, since supposedly it's already underway. The size of the hazard constituted by the consequences of climate change often is portrayed as immeasurable, all-encompassing and inescapable because global. And finally, the degree of vulnerability of human society is assumed to be indefinitely high and in principle irremediable. So it is no surprise that when in receipt of contemporary climate change messaging, many people, especially young with limited experience of the actual hazard of this world, perceive it to be doomed. This framing in turn suggests a number of practical dead ends. For example, given a foregone catastrophic conclusion of history, climate action may legitimately consider it useless. And consequently, individuals may perhaps justly assume that it would be best to retreat to their private sphere. This retreat to the individual sphere may be conjoined with a certain, quote, feel-good approaches, such as recycling, green consumerism, or even cutting loose from environmental concerns by focusing on private individual pleasures, since, after all, nothing is perceived as making a difference anyway. Alternatively, such an envisaged apocalyptic conclusion of history may suggest to some that extremist actions, including a forceful revolutionary dismantling of present societies, is justified, irrespective of the risks that this may entail, given that their collapse is in any case assumed to be inevitable and virtually imminent. Furthermore, it is small wonder that for those of a very sensitive nature, climate anxiety may become traumatic, since an inevitable catastrophe is quasi by definition beyond anyone's capacities to cope with. For those who believe that climate change can and needs to be addressed in a cool, well thought out and concerted way, this situation shifts the problematic in a new and worrisome way, since now the concern is not just about the environmental consequence of climate change, but the debilitating consequence of often traumatic climate anxiety. Fortunately, once recognized, I believe, this latter situation may be manageable. So, addressing a traumatic climate anxiety. There are a number of efforts being made to help those suffering from eco and climate anxiety. On this campus, for example, environmental studies does stuff on this, and also the UVSP's University Sustainability Project, they do stuff like that recently last week. So there are efforts being made to help those suffering from eco and climate anxiety, for example, through action and reflection with opportunities directed toward young people. More to the point, however, may be to directly address the source of the anxiety. So if traumatic climate anxiety largely is conditioned by the story that is being told about the climate changes that are underway, when the components of that story should be subjected to careful scrutiny and possibly adjusted, then the components of that story should be subjected to careful scrutiny and possibly adjusted. All three basic elements of the risk formula set out above need to be considered. First, is there a firm probability about the likelihood that societies are moving towards catastrophic conditions? Given that, as the IPCC and other reports repeatedly make clear, future climate states of the planet are almost entirely, if not entirely, dependent on what our societies jointly do from the present onward. Probabilities regarding catastrophist outcomes surely need to be treated with caution. In the worst case, if enough decision makers suppose that the catastrophist scenarios are likely correct, such speculations may work as self-fulfilling prophecies, despite best intentions. Second, even if contemporary anthropogenic climatic changes certainly will call for large-scale innovative transformations of contemporary ways of life, the precise size of hazard that those climatic changes represent is not certain, since it largely depends in part on society's speed and in transitioning to a low carbon economy. Third, and possibly most important, the vulnerability of human society is neither uniform across the globe nor irremediable. Humans are not mere victims of climatic changes, but actively engage with the challenges that they encounter. Both general and specific coping strategies to deal with climatic changes, as they occur in various regions, are being developed and applied in varying degrees. Consequently, if climate anxiety and trauma are conditioned by the way the story about climate change is told, and if such mental states constitute harms, then that story may need to be reframed. Okay, can you go on? One more. Ah, right. Anybody recognize that location in Canada? Canada, all. Yeah, in Germany, they had something have posters on in travel agents. Something about Canada, wild and natural. Yeah, wild and natural.
It's definitely wild.
Well, let's take on this side of the trees, this side of the trees. I mean, roads are built that way in Alberta, at least, right? You don't see the holes because you have the barrier of a few trees here, right and left. I think BC too. Okay, so ethical responsibilities, fear, and anxiety. Ethical responsibilities in climate messaging. It has long been a topic of debate in philosophy up to what point liberty of expression may go, ethically speaking. At one point of the spectrum, one may find those who, in the name of personal liberty, argue for complete freedom of speech, even when this consequence of a certain utterance may be significant harm. On the other end of the spectrum, there may be those who argue for very great restrictions of liberty of expression in the name of the public good. Can there be harm, when people speak? It's been, in the liberal tradition, it's been a big question. But because we want to, allow for freedom of expression, we have a philosophy there. But I mean, we all aware of the fact that somebody yells "wasp," that may cause a panic and people start running out of the room. I mean, fire, or recuperate. My presidential position in Congress, may cause a bit of a riot. So there may be reasons for restricting certain kinds of speech. So, however, citizens and members of moral communities arguably have responsibilities to prevent serious harm and to support those who are at risk of encountering it. This is the view that accords well with the orientation of major contemporary theories of ethics, including the Kantian approach, utilitarianism, and virtue ethics. Consequently, I won't go into details here, but we're going to talk about it. Consequently, insofar as expressive behavior is realized in more or less discrete language-based actions, those speech acts ought to be evaluated by the same criteria that are deemed appropriate for other types of action, at least when significant harm is foreseeable from their production. This means that insofar as climate anxiety represents a serious harm to considerable populations, and insofar as this anxiety is generated through the framing of climate change and its consequences, those who communicate regarding these matters have a responsibility to consider the manner in which they do it. So if one were to take a utilitarian approach, the question regarding alternative ways of framing this phenomenon would take on a significant urgency, I do not fear. Recall that utilitarianism, given that we are concerned about happiness or pleasure or preferences, the key point about utilitarianism is to maximize happiness or pleasure. And so then the key thing to do is to look at all the alternatives. And so if there's some that bring about that condition in a greater number, greater quantity, then that's to be preferred, right? So if you have a situation where you say, well, we need to do something here about the roads are causing some accidents. Well, so what do you put? What do you put the expansion? What do you do, right? So you try to find a solution that is least causing other trouble and maximizing the positive. So this proposal of finding alternative ways may have to confront the objection that the catastrophist message is necessary in order to get traction with the climate problem. Do I have time for this? I'm at page 7 out of 12. What do you think?
Yeah, you can go for now.
Okay.
10, 15 minutes.
All right. Let me see now.
Skip to page 11.
So, skip the conclusion. So, talking about this, with the climate fear strategies is necessary, whether it's helpful. So, given the slow reaction of governments to take appropriate mitigation, as well as adaptation measures, much of the messaging around the urgency of action on climate change has been directed towards the general public, by arguing that the planet and human existence will be in jeopardy if nothing is done. The underlying supposition seems to be that fear will induce action on a personal level in terms of voluntary individual reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. It has, moreover, been supposed that blaming individuals for inaction of global warming would have as a consequence that their conscience would lead them to act. One may summarize these two strategies as intended to generate sufficient fear and guilt such that a multiplicity of individuals would make up for slow government action. How effective can these strategies be? Unfortunately, such individual actions can only bring about a very limited reduction of sector-based greenhouse gas emissions. If you look at the kind of pie charts that Ted, for example, has shown, there are other very important sectors such as energy, industry, and agricultural sectors, which remain unaffected by individual voluntary actions. Moreover, such individual actions do nothing to accelerate urgently needed adaptation measures to address inevitable consequences of already committed degrees of climate change, in particular among the lesser off in our country, but in many countries that are producing much less greenhouse gas. The bottom line for anyone who is not jaded by unfounded optimism must be that, though welcome, individual action on climate change will be grossly insufficient to meet the challenge posed by present climate change unless additional, very substantial measures are taken of at least 3 sorts. Or not yet. First, measures to restrain major corporate players in the economic system who continue being rewarded for actions that are contrary to the achievement of net zero carbon emissions. As far as I understand, there's the huge subsidies for the oil industry, right? Next, please. Second, to provide enough support, enough support for the transformation of infrastructures such that a changeover to a low carbon lifestyle may be feasible for all. And third, to support those sectors of our societies that are most exposed to climate hazards, so that they can adapt to the new conditions. Given this situation, it seems rather naive to suppose that fear and guilt could be effective strategies for inducing the actions needed. Rather, if the messaging is that individuals are in charge of transforming a system of colossal proportions on pain that otherwise ominous cataclysmic consequence will happen to living systems on this planet, it is small wonder that one important consequence will be climate fear and anxiety. even reaching traumatic levels. Even if fear may constitute a signal motivating action, and I mean, that's common, that's correct, I think. If those who are asked to act do not have the wherewithal needed to do so, the result cannot be anything but unmitigated and continuous distress. In other words, when well-meaning action appears to be useless in the face of the size of the hazard and the degree of vulnerability, anxiety has to be the consequence. It may furthermore provoke certain coping mechanisms such as denial of the reality of the phenomenon, aggression against its messengers, we've seen that, and possibly rage and self-destructive behaviors, suicidal. This leads to consideration of the role of the framing of climate change. Next. Right. So narration and implantment. I have quite a bit here, but I'm going to skip most of it. If climate anxiety, at least to a considerable degree, is the result of climate being framed as catastrophic, then one key measure to take may be to change the narrative. Narratives are powerful ways of drawing in audience attention due to the fact that they can give structure to the disorder of human experience and imagination. So it's just been a topic of research in various fields. So now also history, famously Hayden White, I don't know if anybody read him, he argued convincingly that history is not out there. History is made by historians who take the chronicle of events and make kind of a connection of certain events and then give it a genre, kind of an emplotment in terms of either tragedy or irony or romance or comedy. So consequently, to propose alternative ways of narrating climate change need not imply lack of realism, because those saying the chronic is taken out, but in different ways. There may be, in fact, equally valid and comprehensive accounts of what we jointly agree to be the facts, but structured in a different way, depending on one's view of human capacities and society's readiness to act. Consequently, we may be able to assemble richer perspectives on the reality of our world by exploring alternatives to the standard climate change narratives leading to doom and gloom. That is, catastrophist accounts suggest that we are determined to follow a tragic emplotment of climate change events. However, if climate change can be plotted in other ways, that may allow us to see the future as open. In other words, if the future is not plotted as already determined one particular way, then people can view themselves as agents who are free to contribute to a future that at least partially reflects their own choice. Elements that may serve to implot such an alternative account are sketched in the following. So now talking about the alternative framing of climate change. I'm skipping a fair bit here. So if the cause of falling into catastrophist narratives is grounded in the supposition that humans are inexperienced in living through large-scale climatic changes, that we have no time left to prepare for consequences of such changes, that unless we massively mitigate almost immediately, we face unbearable living conditions, and that we're all equally responsible for the present situation, we ought to consider the following 4 points. Okay, here's the first. Not very well is a picture painted by people 36,000 years ago, representing the view of the world that they had and showing their skills and the time that they had to develop that capacity for drawing and painting. It's the Chauvet cave in France.
Are those by Neanderthals or Homo sapiens?
These are Homo sapiens, yeah. There are some.
There's art from Neanderthals as well.
Not great art. There are some supposed drawings that they have done, but it's uncertain whether, in fact, they were done with them. There's some debate about that. So, 4 points. The first one. The parcours of Homo sapiens sapiens throughout the generally chaotic climates of the 300,000 years of our species' existence. If nothing else, our survival through those conditions while relying on much more rudimentary knowledge bases and technologies should give people some respite. I mean, and I should have brought that slide of the climate in the Pleistocene, which has like it's very, very deep zigzag, right? And then get to the Holocene, there's a tiny little, bit of change there, right? So, right, so that's next slide. The fact that among emergencies, climate change figures as slow in comparison with fast phenomena, such as, for example, the recent COVID-19 pandemic, and I wrote about that. So though the size of the hazard represented by the consequence of present climate change certainly is of another order than the pandemic, societies may have far greater opportunities to intervene because it's a slow-moving kind of a phenomenon. Third, the reality that in addition to urgently needed mitigation policies, climate change may be addressed by complementary measures, namely adaptation, strengthening resilience, and transformation of societies. Even if these approaches are receiving greater attention as of late, narratives that suggest that we are on our way toward collapse of human and natural systems tend to give them short shrift. Here comes Oliver's work again. So next. While we have certainly a certainty that present climate change unequivocally is the result of, quote, human activities, end of quote, it is increasingly evident that it is the result of the insufficient regulation of certain sectors of our economies, energy, land use, industry, transportation, buildings, according to the EPA. This allows for the externalization of globally hazardous costs, the emission of greenhouse gases beyond the sustainable capacity of sinks, atmosphere, ocean. So while blame often is shifted onto selfish human nature or directly onto, quote, hostile climate, as a new blog video is called, both of which would be uncontrollable. Human nature, if you have it, you have it. And if the climate is hostile, well, there it is. Both of which would be uncontrollable. The problem rather seems to be a matter of socioeconomic policy, which in principle is within human control. Each of these 4 points may be worth further exploration, which, however, would go beyond the limits of this paper. Suffice it to note a few comments here. So I'll go quickly through a couple of points here, and then I'm done. Okay. Regarding point 1, let me go back to 1. Yeah, thank you. It may be objected that though the capacity for adaptation of our species have increased immeasurably thanks to greater know-how, sophisticated technologies, advanced forecasting and modeling, the changed life conditions implied by a world population of nearly 9 billion people and important military, political, and socioeconomic problems make human survival in earlier, simpler times irrelevant. Often you hear this kind of point. In response, we may note that though the point is well taken, in principle, the particular socioeconomic and political problems noted are really about human societies and not about climate change per se. If severity of challenges due to climate change is the issue, we may recall that humans in the 120,000 years prior to the warm, climatically stable Holocene lived through 6 sudden cooling and 20 rapid warming events. The latter have been described this way. Quote, typically the events start with an abrupt warming of Greenland of some 5 to 10 degrees over a few decades or less, right? Extremely sudden. The cooling event similarly could be abrupt, showing up in, quote, Greenland ice cores as a further 3 to 6 drop in temperature, 3 to 6 degrees Celsius drop in temperature from the already cold climate. Regarding point 2, please go to, it may be objected to the sequence of disastrous forest fires, floods, heat waves, and other such climate change phenomena appear to be accelerating. Though true that the number of climate-related incidents is increasing, the pace at which the atmosphere is warming is slow enough for a number of significant preventive and remedial measures, such as moving away from floodplains, a very simple kind of thing that's been done, of the type that are only available to a very limited extent during phenomena such as the recent COVID-19 pandemic, where it couldn't move anywhere. and protect yourself. That is, our opportunities for action regarding climate change are vastly greater than in the case of the pandemic because of its relatively slow pace. Regarding point 3, one may add that one reason why a considerable proportion of our youth may be caught up in panic is that complementary measures such as for adaptation, strength and resilience and societal transformation have not entered much into the public discourse. Regarding point 4, thank you. As already noted, it's not at all surprising that youth should suffer from a collective state of neurosis when confronted with the message that actions by individuals are to rectify the present situation that they have been born and raised into. Once it is recognized that present conditions are the result of political choices regarding the management of the economic system, opportunities for collective political action should become more evident. Conclusion. One more slide, please. I've argued that climate fear, anxiety, guilt, and trauma are debilitating conditions that may be disabling people in various ways, including in their capacity for climate action. Framing of climate change consequences appears to constitute a significant part of the cause for these conditions. Since communicators have responsibility for their messaging, and since reframing the way that climate change consequences are narrated is quite possible, such reframing is called for. It is proposed that since such reframing can free us from supposing that our future is already determined as ending with inevitable catastrophe, it would make climate action meaningful, thereby enabling it. Thank you. My next slide. That's an artwork by one of my favorite artists, Richard Long. Next.
That's your favorite one?
Well, not finished. Go on.
I like that art.
There.
Okay.
Wow.
You like the artist? Yeah. This one here on the right. This way. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. It's great to hear a systematic account of your change, attitude in teaching, and so that gives us a different perspective, understanding your rationale for changing your whole approach to talking about this. And it's an issue that I think is on almost everybody's mind as well. So thank you for bringing this to us.
Maybe I can have 1 minute for a washroom break. I'm back.
Okay, we raise the difficult questions now. When you come back, you get we're all strengthens. Like talking, who would like to start us off? The narration, what kind of stand? Okay, Laura first, and then Stan, thank you for being such a gentleman, so.
Oh, super appreciated, your talk. I've spent a lot of time kind of thinking of this as a practitioner, right? In exactly this field.
Yeah.
Do this, right?
Yeah.
And I guess sort of jumping off from one of your points is like around the ethical responsibility. It's like, what is important? Is there like, what is the how-to of that, right? Because it is really tailored. It's like, what audience am I talking to? What are their triggers going to be? Like, it's really relationship-based is what I'm finding, and because is place-based, we can really know our audience and engage with them where they're at. And I mean, all of us can chime in and move forward, right? And but yeah, I'm just curious, like, is it possible to have like a broader how-to guidelines? I do often sort of touch on like these pre-communications questions, which really are values and sound very simplistic, but can be helpful, which is it true? Is it kind? And is it important? And I think if you hit all 3 of those, great. Sometimes you need to communicate when you only hit 2, but even the is it kind is really dependent on who I'm talking to, right? If they're traumatized or what is their experience, what do they need to hear? Like, and sometimes people are like, this is true and this is important and we're all gonna die in 20 years. And it's like, but wait a second. That's your time is gonna set you back. It's really that practical and very applicable to the work I do. Like, how do we do it, right?
Yeah. I mean, you know the answers better than I do, obviously. But I mean, from my outsider perspective, who's not a practitioner, right? It's a question of opening up the vision that the picture is larger than you think, than you've been told, right? Because, you know, like the information we get is pretty tailored to saying, well, you know, like, because of course, the good intentions are generally, right, of saying, yeah, you know, we need climate action, we can only get climate action if people are upset. And, you know, there are reasons to be upset because, you know, the world is going to pot, right? So the message is limited, and of course, people's capacity to observe information is limited, right, or time and so on, right? But I mean, if you think about climate anxiety, I think, you know, from the research I've done on this, is grounded in uncertainty, and uncertainty about two kinds of things. You know, what really is happening, you know, what the world is like, how it functions, and what can be done about it, right? So you're uncertain, you know, about those two matters. And so the kind of general answer would be to say, well, enrich, you know, people's grasp from, you know, where they are at. Of course, it's going to be different in different situations and different contexts and so on, right? But, you know, what is it that they think they know that could be added to, so that they start seeing that there are options for action? And then, you know, oftentimes they don't have the wherewithal to act in that situation. So what, you know, what can they do, right? I mean, oftentimes in a pretty extreme situations, even in emergencies, people come up with interesting solutions. You know, I'm not saying that this is the ultimate solution, obviously, because it's very unjust, the situation, but there's a case that I often ask my students to read about, which is about a place in near the city of Concepcion in Chile, where they had some major rains, some major, you know, storm, and there are a lot of parts of the population who live in the popular areas, like in Spanish, áreas populares, where, you know, people live in, you might call it shanty, you know, on steep hillsides, right? And so, you know, obviously they shouldn't be living there, but they live there because their jobs are nearby, they have no other place to live, and so on and so on. And so in one of those communities, they saved a lot of lives, because there was enough of a coherence among the, you know, like connection among people, that they communicated about what's happening in such a way they say, well, okay, like it seems like the rain is going to continue, and it's going to be threatening the houses of certain people who have who are not aware of this, that they're in danger, and or maybe unable to move themselves, and so they knocked on doors and got people out of houses where the risk of the house sliding down the hill was great, and so they had no victims, no fatalities there. While in the adjoining areas where they didn't have this kind of resilience kind of response, they're caught up, right? So there are ways in which people can respond and do respond once they have enough, you know, both understanding, you know, just doesn't have to be maximized, so just, you know, some understanding and some sense of what options there might be out there when they didn't think they had options, right?
Yeah, thank you. From that, it's kind of like this, how do we not fear uncertainty? Maybe is like a guiding question. And a guiding quote from me from Buddha's Human Children is, let your curiosity be greater than your fear. And I feel like that plays into some of what you're saying here as well. I find that very helpful. That's a touchstone for me.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So we have Stan, Beate, and then Ivan, and then Oliver.
Oh, I'll see.
Okay,
I'll put myself in the queue and then.
Okay, let's see what Ivan has to say, and then, okay, Stan, okay.
Thank you, Tom. You already know my question because I already sent them to you.
Well, of course, anxiety is what's kept our species alive, right? Seeing as everything out there has been trying to, you know, roam around.
Yeah.
Well, we kind of kill each other, eat each other, and whatever, take each other's nests and so on. But anyhow, anxiety is pretty useful. Neurotic Neurosis, however, of course, is anxiety run amok, like it no longer has that is unattached to any sort of meaningful action. By the way, the kind of meaningful action, in my mind, that we take in order to channel our anxiety usefully is in the area of mitigation or adaptation.
Oh, okay.
And it seems to, for people like me at least, the worry about climate change is in fact not so much the actual physical effects, although that's very real and needs to be challenged, but it is the fact that, as we've talked about so many times in this room, it's actually the breakdown of the liberal democratic systems that and their ability to do stuff like rise to the challenges of issues like climate change. And so it comes down to, so anyway, so it brings me to sort of saying, well, there's a whole range. If we could get people beyond being paralyzed by fear, but rather look at the rational roots of their anxiety and actually take action accordingly. An important part of that would be to get involved in democratic process to make sure we don't have crazy people in charge when it's time to take action in the face of catastrophe. What would you think about that?
Very much. I mean, one of the points I tried to make a couple of times throughout the paper is that the problems we have are social, political, economic, and those are within our control because we created those conditions and we can modify them in principle, even if, depending on which society you're in, in what historical moment you're in, opportunities for, improving things are not the same as in other moments when, so it's not a given, but in principle, climate change, as a physical process is not the issue, because humans have lived with that again and again and again. It's what we do with it. So it's a question of addressing how our societies are structured and whether those who are capable of doing governance have the tools and the legitimation and the authority and are authorized to actually intervene in the way that's needed. That's my answer to your question, I think.
Thanks for your patience, man. Here
No, no. So
you could fix that, right?
Thanks for your talk. So my two questions are as follows. So I have one objection, one question. So my first objection comes to your false strategies or false ways of dealing with climate anxiety. For the first one, you said, well, we just have to remind ourselves that humankind as a species has been through several such events in its history, right? I'm not sure if that gives a lot of solace to people who feel climate anxiety.
Sorry, you're not sure what?
I'm not sure it gives a lot of solace or a lot of comfort, or a lot of comfort to the people who feel climate anxiety, because it's a bit like saying, oh well, don't worry, we'll survive escape. Like we'll just go back to the Stone Age and we'll survive. I think a lot of people fear climate change precisely because it's going to come with a decrease in the standards of living, right? And like a change in the lifestyle. And it's what people are most afraid about climate change. So telling them, well, we just survive as hunter-gatherers, like we did like in the past, that's not very comforting, isn't it? So that's my first objection. My question is basically that, so I find personally climate anxiety extremely puzzling, mostly because I find climate anxiety extremely puzzling.
Puzzling. Okay,
Yes,
yeah.
mostly because I personally don't feel it at all. And the reason I find it puzzling is basically that, so if you look at human casualties, climate change is the most uncatastrophic catastrophe in the history of humankind, right? Climate-related deaths or environmental-related deaths are at an all-time historical low, mostly because our societies are much more resilient, right, towards these sort of events. So I sent you by email the example of the Black Death, right? So 50 to 70% of European population wiped out in 20 years, mass graves everywhere. double-digit excess mortality rates. This is like a disaster, right? And if you look at middle-aged art, indeed, you can feel the anxiety, right, which is generated by that event. But we don't really see this, right, in with climate change. And so I'm really puzzled by why people, given that it's not right now, at least it's not so catastrophic. I'm really puzzled by why people see it as such a catastrophe, right? And that's what you said. It's just like a problem we saw.
Messaging, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, communication, right?
Yeah.
It works, right? But as far as your first point goes, I'm a bit puzzled by your point, because I think I didn't suggest that we need to go back to hunting and gathering, though maybe we should. But
No, saying, oh, well, don't worry, worst case, civilization will collapse and we just go back to caves.
No,
Well,
absolutely not.
Okay.
I never ever said that,
Okay.
or wanted to suggest that.
Oh, okay.
No, on the contrary, right? That, people who had absolutely no idea how the climate system works, right? Were struck, every sort of 2 or 3 or 4,000 years by a major climatic change, right? I mean, going to many more degrees than we have now on, right? And they, everything changed, right? And then they had variability, right? Variability was so extreme, so much that from one year to the next, the climate would be playing crazy things on them, right? So, but anyway, so they would have to change location, they would have to change what they gathered, like the kind of foods that they put, tubers or berries, or the animals would migrate, everything would change. And so their patterns of collecting would be disturbed, and they would have to do this, innovate, right? And so, I mean, there's some recent research that convincingly shows that we have become the kind of hyper innovators that we are now, that we are showing ourselves to be, because we had to do that just to keep on living throughout the last 100,000 years, right? Because, and also hyper communicators, right? That, each group figures out a way of dealing with certain problems, how to collect something or how to make a better tool. And when they talk to the other neighbors, then they exchange information and they become better at it. So this is so the point is simply that people who had no information about what's happening to them were actually doing quite well, because we're all descendants of them, and we're not talking about, Neanderthals, we're talking about humans. Humans, have been, as Homo sapiens sapiens, have been, latest research shows, around for 300,000 years. They thought 200, now it's 300,000 years. There's a cave in Morocco that they found recently, confirms that. And they had interactions with Neanderthals. Yeah, sure. Yeah, so. But anyway, so there's no idea of going back to hunter-gatherers. And that I'm not suggesting that collapse is going to happen. Collapse will happen if we don't control certain societies, if we don't control a political economic context. That's to me evident.
So Beate, Oliver, Kat, and Fazila.
So thank you, Tom. And I think you're describing something that happens to our youth here in Canada, or in a bubble
That's
that
right.
we do have at the university, maybe too, or in specific groups. So my question is actually going in this direction, that there are a lot of different groups with different motives. And somehow I wonder, if it's not beneficial to, like check up the theme into more group-oriented analysis, because we have so many interests there. There are people who never experience climate anxiety, people that benefit from climate change.
Sure.
And so it strikes me like, is this group that has this anxiety so crucial in order to move us forward or not? Because behind, I think, your paper, there's this hope that we change something into a positive action and address the climate change. So I would be really interested to identify those groups and the amount of the groups that, maybe understand like,
Mm.
is this group the one we have to worry about the most of this the other one that actually doesn't care about climate change and wants to extract and, you know, earn money, or lobbyists or whoever, like, and why are we having those motives there and not here? So it just strikes me as a, like, if your goal of this paper is towards mobilizing actions, is this?
Okay, so no, my goal isn't that. My goal is to address a maybe North American phenomenon among certain sectors of educated youth in North America, Canada, who, because of climate anxiety, in my analysis, are less able to engage in climate action of the kind that is constructive. And, you know, whether it's a large or small number, sure, there's some research that shows that, you know, global kind of research in places like India, Russia even, and so on and so on. And the rates, now, of course, the way the question is posed is really, an issue, right? But the way it was, the way the results are that it's between 50 and 70% of the youth who respond with climate anxiety. And
In which countries and
so
worldwide?
So yeah, they had some like 12 countries globally, right? So from various places, like including India and Russia and North America and New Zealand and so on and so on. So it seems to be a widespread phenomenon. Now, one sort of bias is these are university students in each case, right? Of a certain age range and so on, right? But I mean, to me, that's sufficient concern for me, to concern me, right? Because those are the people that will be running societies, that will be making decisions in the societies. And even if it's just, at University of Victoria, I mean, every single female student in my classes has said that they have experienced climate anxiety. Some of the guys too, but not as high, not as high a proportion. There's some research shows that somehow it has to do with, the kind of cultural, imprinting of women to kind of transmit and choose this answer, right? There's some studies, supposedly, right? Indicators, right? So anyway, but the point is that basically 70% or 80% of my students have this, that's, and it's, if my students have it, it's not a unique sample.
Before I hand over to you a little bit, just a quick factual question. Are there empirical studies looking at comparative narratives about climate change and from different cultural, national background? Will be interesting,
No, I haven't seen those. But it's right, other problems, like the youth in the Andean region, for example, have a very different problem.
Right.
It's the mining, it's the exploitation by the urban elites and so on and so on, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So I mean, there's a lot of threads we could pull on here, but I'm going to just start with. So you kind of present the argument as, we've communicated poorly, and if we communicate better, that will help. And so I have a couple of thoughts on that, to pick up on more a little bit. One of the problems I would argue with the communication, which doesn't address the larger question of does it matter, because it may not matter, or it may not matter to worry about it because we'll just innovate our way out of it. But let's assume it matters. The question becomes, or a concern I have, is the lack of attention to audience. So we can complain about the reports, but the reports are really not meant to speak to a large audience. They have very specific audiences, and I would argue they're very effective for those audiences. And so the complaint is maybe we're missing speaking to the right audience, so we don't understand how change happens. So that's kind of question one. And question two to me would be, or my suggestion would be, what we've witnessed in our project is you can be more effective at communicating if you understand that peer-to-peer communication is probably the most effective way. And so having a scientist, having Dr. Andrew Wheeler tell us how terrible it's gonna be, will work only for the other rational minds in the audience. It will not be, there's not many people who are their peers, so it doesn't work. So the idea of these sort of grassroots, community, neighbor to neighbor kind of conversations is missing. And then I would sort of boil that down to, well, that's basic political autonomy. Nobody has an incentive to do that, right? Nobody is providing the resources to get, you know, people to kind of do that kind of, they're beginning now, I would say, in the last 5 years, you begin to notice. 10 years, it was sort of experimental, 5 years more, but that kind of, so if we were serious about how we communicate about it, and I guess this is unfortunately not much of a question, but like, how would you move up? How would you sort of engage this kind of peer-to-peer communication, which I think is a missing piece in this conversation? Because to lament that the IPCA or that academics write in inaccessible ways is kind of like stating the obvious, like that doesn't, their intention is not to engage.
But
the
you
wide
know,
audience.
so my point is, isn't it all that communication is inaccessible? In fact, I'm talking more about how activists and those who want to communicate to the broad public kind of narrow down the kind of a view towards the future as leading towards a catastrophe, right? And that's accessible as can be because everybody understands that. Now, whether, you know, to relieve the kind of anxiety, right? You need, you need two kinds of anxiety, I think, or two causes for anxiety. You know, one is knowledge and one is what to do about it, right? And those, yeah, some expert may come in and have some good ideas about that. You know, maybe you know, or an expert, right? But I think your point is well taken in terms of one-to-one, you know, community members' communication among each other, right? I know of a case in Australia of a friend of mine, an archaeologist, who one year said, no, I'm not coming to any of the conferences because we've had these terrible fires and people's houses and property have been burned down. And this is in the south, in Victoria State. And he said, I'm spending all my savings on making my house fireproof, you know, like cutting down trees here and there nearby, and then, you know, doing whatever it was and that information he gathered from the neighbors and how to do that, and that it would be key and so on, right? And in Australia, again, one of the guest speakers I have in my courses is Helen Ross, who worked with Figford Berks, who you might know, on community resilience, right? And you know, really fascinating because she says, yeah, you know, like we kind of get people together and then they start, you know, building like community strength and thinking about how to build up resilience towards the next, you know, flooding that they had. There in Brisbane, and they had flooding after flooding. And so, but, you know, like where there's a little bit of coherence, you get a lot of spontaneous action too, where you have some resources, right? Now she said that, you know, one of the amazing things was that before the state was even able to come in to do anything, when there was this major flood and people were on their roofs, some people from the neighborhood sort of created a little flotilla of boats and went around and picked up the people from their roofs, right? It was like, where did that come from, right? So the idea after that was, well, maybe we should, like, ahead of the kind of emergency, start sort of doing some more community building, as they call it. And so people would talk to each other and strengthen their capacity to respond to those kinds of events.
But those things come out of the fact that there's a fear, a real fear.
Well,
so if you don't,
do you think fear? I think it's just awareness of what the hazards are and then acting on them. Awareness doesn't have to be fear, right? It can be, I mean, fear to me is if you do not know how to handle it.
yeah,
That's
maybe
fear.
that's where we're different,
Right.
I'm not sure. I
Well,
would different, like,
awareness
I
of
have to
risk.
be motivated,
Yeah.
so is your argument maybe that too much motivation tips you over into a useless realm, and we should moderate But it depends on the different audiences. If I don't think it's real, I'm not gonna organize myself for something that I think is unimportant.
Well, but you may think it's not really true enough, right? I mean, because otherwise, why would you not think it's real?
We could do this for a while.
Okay, thanks, Tom, very interesting presentation, so many
Thank you.
interesting points to engage. I'm sort of at a loss figuring out what few ones to pick out. I think I got three, and I'll try to express each of them briefly, and we can follow up individually.
Yeah.
So, one, you've critiqued climate catastrophism principally for its psychological and moral effects on the state of mind of citizens, especially young people who hear it, and its effect on the capacity to act effectively.
Right.
You didn't address, and maybe it's not relevant to your argument, the extent to which climate catastrophism is also a deeply erroneous characterization of actual scientific knowledge of climate change, to the point of really it's being fair to characterize it as dishonest, not merely erroneous. Climate's a really messy, complicated thing with embedding dynamics on multiple timescales from day to day, century to century. Every one of them subject to some uncertainty. And the worst things that happen are profoundly uncertain in their character and their distribution. Who gets hit by what with what severity? It's a message that's very hard to communicate fairly and effectively, even to elite audiences, let alone to sort of broader citizen groups. And to the extent you try to do it, what you get is a mix of messages that are profoundly discomforting and profoundly comforting. So here's a discomforting one. The next 20 years is baked in. Nothing that is done in the realm of mitigation or management of emissions will make a damn bit of difference to climate change over the next 20 to 30 years. Actions taken of that form now are managing the severity of change and risks 40, 50, 80, 100 years out and beyond.
Yeah, we know that, yeah.
Yes, we know, actually, most climate activists act as if they don't know it. And then here's something comforting. I mean, global catastrophe is not in the cards. The rhetoric about irreversible catastrophe and tipping points is profoundly misleading. There are no identified mechanisms of global irreversible catastrophe anywhere within the wide space of scenarios. There's an awful lot of terrible discomfort and disruption and things that are catastrophic to particular places and people and communities and activities. But the rhetoric misleads that. So I don't know, maybe this is naive of me, but I imagine that effective communication has to speak honestly about timescales and degrees of capability, both in terms of what is known about timescales of the physical system and in terms of timescales of effective action. People adjust to change. An enormous amount of climate change has already occurred. And not only has an enormous amount of adaptation to it already occurred below the radar, we kind of don't notice. An enormous amount of emotional and perceptual adjustment has also occurred. People don't live long enough to remember how winters were when I was a kid. Certainly not when my parents were a kid. So it's like skiing and maple syrup are going to disappear from New England. And they already partly have. They already to a very significant degree have. And it isn't going to make that much difference because the people who would have cared the most will be dead by the time it happens. I remain deeply, so the only it's actually mixed, but if what you heard is human suffering, I would say that actually is comforting because it is an attenuation of expected human suffering, right?
Yeah.
You know, the only person I know who complains about the loss of maple syrup in New England, you know, is 85 years old.
So, I mean, to address that point, right?
Yeah.
So,
Can I actually just finish on timescale responses, and then I'll wrap that up. And then
Okay.
You can decide whether you want to hear 2 and 3. Adaptation might have a fast time constant of response, but that's mainly at individual and face-to-face and local community level. Adaptation at larger scale is much more difficult than mitigation. I mean, it's a trick that the opponents of mitigation have played on the populace for 50 years by saying, oh, we can just adapt. What's adaptation mean? Spend a ton more on everything public, impose a ton more restrictions on everything private, and distribute resources from the better off to the worse off to reduce vulnerability. Oh, those are politically easy, you know.
Yeah.
And last point, and this This line of reasoning is one of the reasons I remain deeply perplexed by the categorical rejection of considering fast operating technological alternatives to reduce changes. You know, I know this is something you and I have a profound difference on, but it's like your own argument speaks to the importance of considering things that would actually make a difference faster because of the slow dynamics of the system. That's the end of one. I don't have to do two or three. Dig in. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the business of the lag of effects, yeah. That's one of the knowledge gaps that feeds confusion, right?
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that.
And despair. Tell a young person with climate anxiety, nothing you do will make a difference for 30 years.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things that you keep on hearing is that we can stop climate change. You think, oh my God, you know,
Yeah.
like this creates the impression that you can roll back time to a prior state, you know, before the birth of the young people that we're concerned about, to, you know, whatever was sort of idyllic kind of a condition. Well, I mean, for that reason, I have a climate scientist, Kirsten Zickfeld, coming to my class, you know, like very renowned climate scientist, who says, well, you know, like what we hope for is to come to stabilization of the climate where we are at. And that's going to be that way for 2000 years once we are at net zero. You know, so nothing about rolling back. I mean, you can sort of, you know, do a bit of a sequestering, but it's not like going to be a major thing because it's very expensive. So that's one of the knowledge gaps that can generate, you know, anxiety. Tipping points, yeah, it's become a very fashionable way to talk about some of the real scary things, right? Tipping points, and we move into a different kind of a climate system, which is correct. If we have, you know, past certain tipping points, we will end up in a different climate system. But I mean, they're being used for scaring people, which I think is not helpful. Adjustment have occurred already, and you know, yeah, sure. I mean, the puzzling thing to me is that young people who have had not the experience of what it was like before are being scared about, you know, losing everything because of a climate catastrophe, right? And so that's kind of a crazy kind of a message that we need to really like adjust. Because I think if that's what you're telling them, then they're going to be saying, well, you know, we start liking it here. We have, you know, 18 years now, you know, 19 years living here. And we start liking it being, you know, young and happy in this environment, and it's going to be all destroyed, you know. So that's not, you know, very helpful at all. But they don't have the experience that the 80-year-old has, right? So the adjustment that's already happened, that it's possible, that it's not the end of the world, you know, they don't have that grasp, and that adaptation is costly, certainly, right? I mean, but I mean, there, you know, I think the responsibilities towards our populations, but certainly much more even towards those populations that are being continuously exploited, such that they can't properly adapt to, you know, in better ways than they could, even though they do as they can. Right?
Agreed vis-a-vis responsibility. My comment was about feasibility and difficulty of political action.
Yeah, of course, political action is always difficult.
Yeah.
Do you think I could ask you to schedule another coffee
Yeah.
two of you? Because we're at our end of our season. Oh, I see, really? Are you sure? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, but clearly, yeah. Okay, then quick and then wrap up.
Yeah, just really again, your words about it helpful at all, right? And super narrow, like what you're saying about this big point being part of the problem, this openness, but in some of my own digging and learning and looking around some of this stuff, I came across, I don't know if you know, Julia Watts-Belser, and she does a lot on disability wisdom. And it's super interesting to me because I actually think after reading some of her work that there is this thread of like ableism, right? It's like there's this bad thing and we don't want it. We just have to be healthy and good and whole. And it's been, and so she brings these really, to me, profound thinking, I have a quote here, if you'll let me read it. She says, she's talking about hope and, this idea of good news on the horizon and how that's dangerous, which to me is similar to like, we must stop climate change. And she says, I'm much more interested in helping us ground an understanding of hope that emerges out of shared dreams and struggles, and when it isn't immediately shattered if we receive bad news. So there's your resilience. Disability communities have powerful wisdom to offer for thinking about living well, even when there's no good prognosis on the horizon, there is no cure. These insights are really important to bring into our conversation about climate change. For example, disability wisdom shows us that you can live beautiful, vibrant, disabled life, and at the same time recognize that some parts are really tough. So I just love this overlay of like, yeah, there's even a bigger picture here, and what are the voices and what are the experiences that can help with reframing. And I think there's pockets of society that do that already.
Absolutely,
So a bit of a tangent, but it felt super relevant. Thank you for letting
Thank you
me
so much for
go
that.
through it.
Yeah.
And